From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, welcoming you to another conversation about Chicago, the city that we love and love to talk about. You know, this morning, I got out my Plativ survey for my little bungalow, and I just was kind of looking through because I just wanted to be sure I was right about this. And this is what I found out. The lot line, okay, the edge of our property that abuts the city of Chicago's property is about 3 inches shy of the edge of the sidewalk. Then beyond that is the parkway, the curb, and the street. So in my particular situation, about half of the distance from just inside the basement to about where the water main would be under the street, about half of that distance is on city property. Now that's going to come up again in this discussion today because, well, it has to do with service lines, the EPA, electromechanical interaction, historic municipal negligence, and some really, really good journalism. For about a generation now, it's been pretty universally accepted that no amount of lead is good to have inside your body, none at all. So if that's the case, why is the city of Chicago pumping lead into almost every house and apartment through their water faucets? And has the city been trying for a long time, maybe decades, to hide this fact from the citizens? Well, we've all witnessed that tragedy of Flint, Michigan, but we have a somewhat similar situation here. It's not the same, but it's kind of similar, and it's about 100 times larger, and it'll require years of diligence and loads, boatloads of money to rectify. And one of the journalists in Chicago I most admire is back here at the table with us. Michael Hawthorne writes about this and other things environmental for the Tribune. Mike, welcome back.
Great to be with you.
It's great to have you back. The city of Chicago is mandated by the EPA to test its water. But you've reported in the past that the way they do that is they just give test kits to like guys who work for the water department and recent people who retired from the water department, and they come back and say, it's fine, nothing to worry about. This is not what you would call a rigorous scientific study.
It's legally compliant, but technically compliant according to the rule that was devised with heavy input from municipalities, municipal water utilities like Chicago's back in 1991. But it doesn't actually do the job in terms of telling citizens whether their water is safe. That's true. And it is pretty remarkable. The city of Chicago, they're on their 3-year cycle right now. They'll be testing 50 homes again this year.
Only every 3 years.
Every 3 years in a city of 2.7 million people. 50 homes that are supposed to be representative of the city. Mm-hmm. And the Chicago Department of Water Management has decided that the representative parts of the city are Morgan Park, Beverly, Oriole Park, Edison Park, whatnot. And one, I mean, the last time around there were literally, I went over the data several times a couple of years ago when we revealed this for the first time. Mm-hmm. And literally on one block in Oriole Park, 3 homes of the 50 were tested, and all owned by employees of the city of Chicago.
And they were clean?
All of them.
All
Zero.
Of them. That's good.
No lead.
That's good. So therefore we can extrapolate from that, interpolate from that the city is in pretty good shape.
Well, and that's what the city will still tell you. Mm-hmm. Every year under federal law, we all get a brochure in the mail.
That's
it's
right.
called the Consumer Confidence Report. It's got a nice picture of Mayor Emanuel on it. Used to have a picture of Mayor Daley on it. And
picture of Lake Michigan.
Usually a picture of Lake Michigan, and there's a little note from the mayor in there talking about how we are so fortunate to have this wonderful, clean source, safe source of drinking water. Right. And then inside there's a bunch of, for lack of a better word, mumbo jumbo
technical
about
data,
what they're supposed to be telling us about our water, and everything always comes out right. There's barely a mention of lead in any of these reports, even though we have more of these lead service lines than any city in the country.
Well, that's obviously the point of the conversation today, but I thought we'd start with talking about how we've been testing for lead, and then get to what is, I think, just an absolutely earth-shattering piece that you wrote on, I think it was the 12th of April or something. Sounds around right. There, about what has happened with other testing that's been going on and how the numbers now look a lot different. But I guess we really should talk about this thing about In general, we are probably the richest water city in the world, us and Toronto, I would say. We just live on this vast resource. We can pump almost as much of this water out as we want, according to the law. And we process it, we filter it, we make it good, and then we put it through these big old pipes and send it out to every neighborhood in the city. And if you went out and dug a hole in the street and tapped into that water main in front of your house, the water coming out of there would be just about as clean as you could expect municipal water to be.
That's true. That's true. I mean, and you might find we've found in the past there's traces of pharmaceutical drugs, for example, that are out there in the lake that go through the water treatment system. There are legitimate questions about some of these things that they call emerging contaminants. It's more just
things we haven't know about.
Yeah, or we haven't looked for them before, and
yeah.
so we have the ability to look for them now. Let's set that aside,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
In general, for what the law requires in terms of providing safe drinking water, Chicago does that. And you're right, we are incredibly blessed to be on this amazing body of fresh water. It's, the Great Lakes are 20% of all of the fresh surface water in the entire world.
So your
we're
house,
great in that respect.
Your house or your apartment building has a little drinking straw under the ground that taps into that water main. And that is the problem.
And if your home was built before 1986, that straw is made of pure lead, a very potent neurotoxin. It's amazing. I mean, it's
incredible to consider.
It blows your mind actually to think that 1986, it was not that long ago. We were the last major city in America to continually require the use of lead to convey water from streets to homes.
And that's an important word, require. It
Required.
wasn't just like we tolerated it. We forced
the plumbing
plumbers.
code required it.
Yeah.
So you didn't have a choice if you were building a new home in Chicago until 1986. Places like Milwaukee, even Boston, New York City, they stopped it a long time ago. And you can't make an argument that somehow with lead, we didn't know. Some of these other things, we didn't know they even existed, or we didn't know that they could cause harm, especially at the low levels that they can turn up in drinking water and air and whatnot. We knew this about lead a long time ago. The Romans knew about it centuries ago. So the fact that this was allowed to continue to happen just boggles the mind.
So what we're seeing now is that the city delivers this, let's just say for our sake of argument, relatively pristine water right to your doorstep. Or close to your doorstep, but right in front of your house. And then this pipe that comes between there and into the water meter in your basement and ties into your plumbing in your house is injecting lead into the water that you are using and drinking.
And what makes it even more confounding is that lead can leach out of these pipes at any point in time. And it's really difficult to predict. And as a result, it's difficult to get a handle on when there is testing. And so you mentioned the testing part and the 50 homes that the city samples every 3 years. One of the other problems with that is the type of testing that the city does, the type of testing that currently federal regulations require. And it's only 1 liter of water drawn after water hasn't been used for 6 hours, at least 6 hours. So usually first thing in the morning. So that's supposed to capture basically the water that's been sitting between the street and your house overnight. But what a lot of scientists are finding in not only Chicago, but all kinds of places around the country, is that doesn't capture your potential exposure to lead. Sometimes that first liter of water drawn can be, according to the test results, lead-free. But if you kept the water running and stuck a sample bottle under the tap, say after 6 liters had gone through the faucet or 10 liters had gone through the faucet, there could be incredibly high levels of lead in the water at that point in time. We don't normally test that way. And there are some logistical issues involved in testing that much water. But when it's been done, it shows that you can think you're safe, you can be told you're safe by the city, by the federal government, and yet you may not be, and you might be, your family might be exposed to this this neurotoxin. It's not just bad for kids. We know that it's definitely bad for kids in the sense of it causes permanent brain damage. And at the lower levels now, they call it subclinical. It's not like the stories that people who are a little bit older used to remember seeing in the paper or on TV about children actually dying from lead exposure or being severely mentally retarded. It's more subtle than that, and the effects are early, and they last throughout life, and so it's knocking a few IQ points off of a child's ability to learn. It attacks parts of the brain that deal with executive functions, the ability to remember, the ability to stay on task, all the kinds of things that school teachers are really, have a problem with some kids early on in the early grade school years. And it's not just kids, adults. There's a recent study that was published in The Lancet, which is a London-based medical journal, one of the oldest scientifically peer-reviewed journals in the world. They figured out that roughly 18% of all deaths in the United States, these are adults, people are dying, and you can attribute that to lead exposure. It's heart disease that was caused by lead exposure. So the effects of lead can last very long. It's cumulative because it's an element. It stays in your body. Bits and pieces can come out through you, when you go to the bathroom and whatnot. But the risk is there, and the fact that Chicago, we have a problem obviously we had a lot of lead industry a long time ago in the city, so we had a lot of deposits of lead in our soil. We had leaded gasoline. That left, and we were a big transportation center, that left a lot of lead in the soil. Lead-based paint was still around until 1978, and we have a lot of older houses, so that's an issue. And now the water. Right? The water's it's always been there. This problem has always been there. We're only really now getting to the point where we're trying to figure out just how much of a risk that is posing to people in the city of Chicago.
To get back to this service pipe deal, I doubt that there's even 1% of houses or apartments in Chicago that have any lead plumbing in them, where there's pipes actually inside the house.
Sure, and that's an issue too.
There may be some of that,
right.
But that's all. I mean, that's just been replaced over the last.
It depends.
60 years or so.
It depends, right. And certain fixtures, even up until very recently, had traces of lead still in them.
But still in all, what we're talking about in probably 95% of the cases is these service lines. So the obvious answer is, well, let's pull them out and replace them. They're only 25, 30 feet long. I mean, it's disruptive, but it's not that big a deal. Let's just replace them. And the city, you reported just the other day, the city went to court and got the court to agree that the city is not, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but the city is not liable for replacing them because they're on private property. Is that fair?
It was a little more complicated than that, a little more nuanced than that. The judge in that case, I read that decision basically saying this judge didn't want to deal with it. Did not want to be the person who ordered the city of Chicago to
spend
do this.
Hundreds of
Let's
millions
let the appellate court decide, because you read through his decision, and all of the things we're just talking about are out there. He even starts the opinion out saying, for the purposes of my analysis, I'm going to assume that everything that's been alleged is true in terms of the toxicity of lead, in terms of certain actions by the city that increases the chances that you're exposed to lead in your drinking water. He's assuming that all of these things are true, but based on a bunch of case law, essentially the plaintiffs in that case didn't have standing.
And who were the plaintiffs?
There were a couple of people living in the city of Chicago. And there's some particulars of their individual situations. You almost get a sense that the judge is saying, this is such a giant problem, the courts shouldn't be the ones to solve it. So then we come to the executive branch or the legislative branch, and that would be the mayor and the city council. Then they just don't want to touch it either.
The city council, that bastion of courageous action. Yeah,
And you can widen that out to the governor.
Yes,
and the legislature.
Well, I mean, look at Flint.
Illinois has more of these lead service lines than any other state.
Is that true? Any other state?
Any other state, and that's mostly because of Chicago. But a lot of these smaller towns have them too.
Yeah.
The difference is after Flint, especially, and we can get into the different, the particulars of why we are not Flint, as the water commissioners have said over time.
Right.
We are and we aren't. Over time, though, other municipalities, other states are taking this seriously. Flint brought this problem to worldwide attention. And so you've got the governor, the very conservative Republican governor of the state of Michigan saying, in 20 years, every lead service line in the state of Michigan, not just in Flint, not just in Detroit, every one of those lead service lines should be gone. You've got Republican lawmakers, the most conservative Republican lawmakers in the state of Wisconsin, getting together and passing legislation that makes it easier for municipalities to come up with programs to begin replacing these service lines, either by cost sharing with local residents or giving some kind of low interest loans, something like that. Same thing with the state of Indiana. They're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in Illinois, it's crickets. In Chicago, it's literally denial that there is a problem. After my more recent story, when we can talk about the details of that in a minute, but the water commissioner once again distributed a letter, and several members of the city council distributed it to their constituents through their newsletters, saying there's not a problem. We follow the law. But as we've talked about already, they can be following the law and there's still a threat to public health.
I've come to the conclusion that lead is one of the very few things in America that actually transcends the great divide that we live in, because Republicans and Democrats will agree that lead is bad for you. at least that far.
Well, that's true, but there's still a problem about accountability. The lead industry has hired a lot of very good lawyers, and over the years they've escaped accountability in courts in places like Rhode Island and Baltimore and Milwaukee. Now there are a few cases still, technically still going through in the courts, including one involving the city of Chicago. Those are mostly dealing with lead paint issues, but they're the same companies, right? And so, and there's a case that's probably the closest thing to ever holding the lead industry accountable is a case that's going on still in the state of California, where they've been sued under a nuisance statute that the state of California has. So getting a handle on this to pay for this, that's a big issue. And I've heard this from a lot of readers of the Chicago Tribune when they've called up after reading one of my stories on this issue is, well, then why the heck is the city digging up my street to do work, say put in a new sewer line or put in a new water main, needed infrastructure work, raising my rates to pay for this, and they're leaving this lead service line in the street. It makes no sense to somebody who's a small C conservative that you're not taking care of more than one problem
that's right.
at the same time.
Something that I don't think you've mentioned in your stories, but it's fresh to me because I lived through this. I'm out on the northwest side where People's Gas decided that they had to replace every gas main and every gas service line to every house in every neighborhood. And we lived through that for almost a year of having all the streets ripped up and shooting these plastic lines through the yard and up and up to the basement.
Well, they were able to go to the Commerce Commission and get the authority to charge us the ratepayers of People's Gas to do that. But that's being litigated by Attorney General Lisa Madigan.
I understand.
It's still,
there are all kinds of controversies with it. And as somebody who lived through it, I'd have to say that I didn't think that it was handled, that the actual process was handled very well as far as notification and everything else. That's a separate discussion. But it's still, I remember thinking at the time, wow, wouldn't you think that while this is going on, you could for like half the price of what it would cost otherwise, you could shoot new water lines in through here?
Well, and
Because
it's something
they're doing it with, they're doing it with these, with the, I don't know what these machines are called, but these underground shooters where it actually literally penetrates all the way up. They're amazing.
It's pretty remarkable,
pieces of
right?
machinery.
I mean, technology, smart people, engineers figure out a way to make things more cost efficient,
yeah.
right? So, right, let's get at that. You're not necessarily having to dig up the entire yard or the entire street to replace these lead service lines. Now, there is a difference. I mean, each one is a little bit different given to the nature of the home, where it's at, where it is on the block, whatnot, how far back it is from the street. But you mentioned this. There's this device that I've seen it used in Lansing, Michigan, where they're replacing every lead service line. They did it earlier in Madison, Wisconsin, where they already have replaced every lead service line. They're doing it right now in Flint. This machine threads a new copper pipe over the top of the lead pipe, and you basically punch a couple of holes in the street, thread it through, and then when it comes back, it brings the old lead pipe with it.
Oh wow! I haven't seen that.
And then
so they're
somebody
actually taking the lead pipes out of the
somebody
ground.
goes into the home and connects the new copper pipe to your internal plumbing,
Right.
and they move on.
Yeah, yeah.
And it at least in Lansing, what they've said is their experience so far is it costs a heck of a lot less. And then you get into other issues like, well, the city of Chicago could make it easier to permit those kinds of things.
Right.
Right now, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
For you, a homeowner. So essentially, what's happened is it's a situation where the city, until 1986, required by law the use of a lead service line to convey water to your home. Now they're saying, you, dear homeowner, dear property owner, it's up to you to decide whether or not
if you'd like to
you want to
make
replace
your family
it
more safe
at your own expense.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, we're going to make it really difficult for you by making you undergo like incredibly costly and burdensome permitting.
Yeah.
It's just going to drive up the cost of that project. Again, it's not going to be fixed overnight. Nobody is saying it's going to be fixed overnight. But other municipalities, other government entities in surrounding states are figuring out a way to do it. And you can go, in the city of Milwaukee, for example, they stopped replacing water mains on streets with lead service lines until they can get a handle on what they're going to do about this. You as a homeowner, as a property owner or a renter, you can go on a site that the city of Milwaukee has. Do I have a lead service line in my home? They'll tell you that, and then they'll give you a bunch of options about what you can do next. One of the things that the mayor of Milwaukee has said is, if you live in a home with a lead service line, you should be filtering your water.
Right.
Now, what we reported in 2016 is the only people in the city of Chicago that were getting that advice were the water department employees who were having their water tested for these official EPA tests. They would get a letter from the city saying, if you're concerned about your water quality, think about bottled water. Think about filtering your water. Meanwhile, they would come onto our streets, just regular Chicagoan streets, and they would rip out your water main in a way that could potentially increase the chances that lead was going to show up in your water. They didn't even mention lead in the handouts, that if you were lucky to see whatever flew between the pizza handouts and the cleaner handouts and whatnot that people jam into your mailbox. They didn't even mention lead.
And this is something that I find really perplexing, is that let's give the mayor some due. He recognized early on when he came into his office that Chicago's water mains were in just absolutely desperate condition, leaking like crazy and desperately in need of being replaced. He billed us for it. He raised taxes so that he could then go out and raise enough money to replace hundreds and hundreds of miles of these water mains. But somehow in this conversation, within his own water department, either nobody ever mentioned to him, oh, by the way, if you do this, you're going to create a whole new crisis, or they didn't know.
They knew.
So how could there? Mike, work with me on this.
I agree. Well, I've tried to get the mayor
meeting.
I've tried to get the mayor to answer that very question.
Just imagine that
the mayor's
meeting
people to
when
answer
the
that very
mayor is
question.
meeting with all of the top brass of the water department, and he says, you know, I am the white knight on the horse. I am riding in to fix this. I'm going to replace hundreds of miles of your water mains that are leaking. And they say, great, thanks. But what about the lead? I mean, didn't that happen?
But they, under federal regulations, they can add these phosphorus-based chemicals, phosphate chemicals to the water supply. It doesn't cause any problems for us, but it supposedly, coats the inside of these lead pipes, reducing the chances that lead is going to start flaking off.
And that actually has been fairly successful as far as we know.
Yes and no,
right?
but what a lot of research from the EPA and independent scientists have found is that there are a number of ways that treatment can be disrupted, and it can be disrupted at any given time. And it's essentially it's like you're playing a game of Russian roulette with your drinking water, with your family's drinking water.
And if you want to talk about disruption, how about the big pipe to which it's connected gets ripped out of the ground and a brand new pipe goes in and they connect this pipe to that new pipe?
There's
That's
these other
disruption.
issues, and that's a big part of it.
Right.
And then sometimes, and we've seen this firsthand, the city work crews, they make it even worse by connecting that lead pipe to the iron water main, but maybe there's something wrong at the end when they've been digging the trench, they broke off a part of it. So they'll connect a piece of copper between the lead that goes into your home, and then there's copper, and then there's the iron water main. That creates what's called a galvanic cell. It's almost like the interior of a car battery. And it electrifies the water essentially, and increases the chances that lead then is going to leach into the water. So not only are they potentially making the problem worse by digging up your street for the necessary infrastructure work that they've raised your water rates to fund, they're also potentially doing it by doing this galvanic corrosion issue, and then they're not telling you anything about it. They're not telling you anything about it that you might be at risk. Instead, they're saying everything is fine. We do a great job. Now, I will say this. This is the point of one of the reasons why you had me on the show is at least 2,797 Chicagoans don't believe the city.
We've been burying the lead here.
Right?
This is the real story.
They're not taking the city at face value. Their statements on this, and it's interesting. A large number of the homeowners or property owners who have had their water tested so far are in the same neighborhoods, Beverly, Morgan Park, or
Edison Park.
Right, Edison Park, who are the same neighborhoods where their neighbors are water department employees, and they're telling them everything is fine.
So wait, back up half a page here. What happened here? The city made testing kits available.
So how
did that happen?
After Flint, after a lot of, I think, stories of mine and the Chicago Tribune raising this issue, one of the ways that people from the water department tried to deflect any criticism was, hey, if you're concerned, dear Chicagoan, we'll test your water for free. And initially they would just send a couple of people out and test the water for you. Well, that gets pretty burdensome when the demand for these tests suddenly becomes more than a trickle. So different people out there. There's a researcher at Virginia Tech, Mark Edwards, who played a big role in exposing what went wrong in Flint and continually testing the water. They came up with this 3-bottle kit, and it's essentially like you take that first sample in the morning, just like what the EPA has certain people do for the official tests. You wait 3 minutes and you take another test. You wait 2 more minutes, so it's 5. The water's been running for 5 minutes, and you take another test, so the city will send you this box with these 3 bottles. You follow the instructions, self-addressed stamp or envelope or box back to the city. They send it to a lab and have it tested. And so the point of this last story that I did was I took all those results.
You got them.
Yeah, well, they're online.
Oh, okay.
It's like a lot of information the city has. They post it online. They just make it almost unintelligible for for people to understand.
Oh, but you said that a lot of it was just hadn't been updated in a couple of years.
It hadn't. Well, no, only a few months. So
right,
this is when I started looking at this. Hey, the city's been at it for 2 years now. They've had most of 2016 and all of 2017. What have they found? And where have they found it? And so what we found was that in 70% of the homes that sent these testing kits into the city, there was some level of lead detected in the water. And in 3 of every 10 homes tested, citywide, that there were levels of lead in the water that exceed, if it was a bottle of water, if you went to the 7-Eleven and bought a bottle of water and the level of lead in the water exceeded this amount, 5 parts per billion, the Food and Drug Administration wouldn't allow it to be sold. So there's no individual limit in a household tap water sample. Instead, these regulations try to look at the overall picture in a community and see if this corrosion control, this addition of these phosphorus chemicals, is doing a good job. That's the 50 homes every 3 years.
Yeah.
So they passed that test, which it seems to be designed to make it very difficult to fail the test. I mean, you have to, like Berwyn at one point violated this rule, and they had to send out a few notices, and then they worked with the people with the really high levels of lead. It went away, and then they stopped warning people that there might be lead in their water. This is where we are at right now. So in the last 2 years, 2016 and 2017, exponentially more Chicagoans have been interested in having their water tested than the city has officially tested since 1991. And we get a much clearer picture that there are high levels of lead throughout the city.
You said 77 community areas. There's
at least one.
At least one in
At least
every.
one.
So it's geographically spread.
It is, but it was concentrated in certain neighborhoods. You know, Lakeview, there were a lot of, maybe like, if I remember correctly, there were maybe 68 homeowners in Lakeview who had requested kits. There were 127 in Beverly and Morgan Park each.
Because it's voluntary.
It is voluntary. So it's not.
We're not getting a good picture of. We're not like
We're
getting
getting a
an
better
aerial
picture.
picture of
We're
the city.
getting a better picture.
Better than 50.
And we're getting a more comprehensive picture that there is a larger, potentially random problem out there that the city is not addressing. And in fact, they're denying it exists, even though this is essentially their own data that they've posted online.
Were you able to, by any chance, overlay this over a map of where the construction's been done?
We did, and if you look online if you go under ChicagoTribune.com/lead, a bunch of stories about that I've written in the last several years about lead poisoning and the lingering issue of lead poisoning in Chicago. This most recent story, you can type in your address if you live in the city of Chicago, and you can find out if any of your neighbors had their water tested and whether they were above or below this FDA standard for bottled water.
Yeah.
And you can also see if the water main has been replaced on your street or in your neighborhood.
We should mention we're putting this on the bottom of the screen. We're putting the Tribune address to go to for that.
Yeah.
So
a colleague of mine, Cecilia Reyes, did a great job in taking this data and laying it over so you can figure out, hey, has anybody near me taken the city up on its offer of these free testing kits? And if so, what do they find?
And the free testing kit offer still stands.
It does.
So this is the address to go to.
And people have reached out to me and said that 311 sometimes directed them to an automated line that then hung up on them, or that the website crashed. So this was initially after the story. I think the lesson is, like anything else with the city, you need to be persistent. And if you're interested in this, keep at them. Because I'm guessing after that story there was another flood of requests.
So where do we stand? I mean, it's your data, the data that the city has collected, shows that there is clearly a higher rate of lead contamination in houses that were voluntarily tested, but these are people who self-select as people who are interested enough that they want to know about it. So if If you came up at 18 or 20 parts per billion instead of the 5, and you saw that you had this problem, what options do you have? Will the city help you in any way other than just say, go get a filter?
They've come out to a few people and tested their water and done this. I talked about it a little earlier in the show. I know this it gets kind of, you get deep in the weeds with this because it's complicated the way they sample and the different ways that they sample, but about 130 homes, they went out and they tested the water. They let the water run and collected bottle after bottle after bottle, 12 consecutive bottles at those homes. And then they'll look at their plumbing to see if there's some kind of issue maybe with the plumbing, or maybe there's an electrical charge somehow in the pipe inside the home, whatnot. And they'll make recommendations, but almost always what they say is you should filter your water. And I'll go back to what the mayor of Milwaukee has said, and informed in part by there's a gentleman named Miguel Del Toro. He's a water expert, a water plumbing expert at the US EPA office here in Chicago, and he was really the key person to expose what was going on in Flint when a woman reached out. At that point, there was this discolored water coming through people's pipes, and she wanted to know what was going on. And Miguel went to Flint, tested her water, found high levels of lead in the water, and that led to this cascading event, these cascading events that exposed government malfeasance, a criminally operated water system.
I would say that, yes.
We don't have that here. What we have is a system where, like Flint, we have a lot of lead service lines. We have a well-run treatment system, but when you have all these lead service lines, a lot of people are going to be potentially exposed to a dangerous toxin. So what Miguel Del Toro has said when he's out in public, he's spoken to people in Pilsen and in East Chicago where they're dealing with their own lead poisoning issues. And he says, if you live in a city with lead service lines, you should be filtering your water. And it doesn't have to be a big giant reverse osmosis system like the woman that we interviewed who's featured in a video that accompanies my story.
And she spent $1,000.
Oh yeah, she went, everything that comes into her house is filtered, and then it's filtered again before it comes through her kitchen tap. You don't necessarily have to do that, but you have to make sure that the filter that you're using, whether it's a pitcher that you put in your refrigerator or something you screw onto your faucet, is certified by something called NSF International, which is a nonprofit group that certifies these water filters. And there's also in the story that you're going to link to, there is a link then to an NSF consumer guide that can kind of help you go through the options for what you can do to help protect yourself. And that's really all we can do until these lead service lines are gone.
If you were a homeowner and you were even crazier, no, I'm sorry, that's not the right word. You were more intense than the lady you interviewed, and you decided you want that lead pipe gone. Can you do it? Can you hire a contractor to come in and replace it?
Yes, I've talked with people who have done it.
And how much does that cost? I know obviously the cost varies greatly, but I mean, is it thousands and thousands?
Well, it depends, right? I've heard people tell me that it cost up to $12,000 per home.
I wouldn't be surprised because they're going to have to dig up the street.
Right, they're digging up the street, and the length of the service line, the permits, everything else like this. Now, in a place like Lansing, for example, Lansing, Michigan, they knocked it down to roughly, on average, $5,000 a home.
Because they were doing so many?
Well, not only they were doing so many, but they also had this more efficient technique where they didn't have to dig up the entire yard and the entire street to do it. And other cities, Boston, Massachusetts, Milwaukee, Madison, Wisconsin, this is a thing that we're seeing more and more of in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana. They're creating programs where essentially they either charge the ratepayers a little extra to do it, much like what we've done to replace these water mains in Chicago. And I will mention that even after Mayor Emanuel doubled our water rates, we still pay less for water than all but something like 5 other metropolitan areas in the entire United States. It's amazing. Flint, Michigan pays more than anybody else in the United States, their water rates.
Wow. Is that since all the repairs have been done?
It was before
It was
and
before.
after.
Wow.
Before and after.
Well, congratulations.
Meanwhile, Chicago, we still pay, even
Yeah.
after Rom doubled our water rates, we still have pretty cheap water.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just seems to me.
So anyway, what's happened is, I'll just finish that thought though, that cost sharing programs or charge it through the rates. There are different ways of doing it, just like any other problem that faces municipal governments or state governments. Each state, each municipality is going to go about it somewhat differently.
Yeah, yeah.
It's happening in all these other places. It's just not happening here.
But here's the thing. Taking a page from the rather poorly handled gas line replacement program, you can't make this thing voluntary. It can't be, if I want it done, I'll have it done. You have to go down a street, rip out that street, and shoot new lines into every house, whether they want it or not. And you have to, and everybody has to
so
pay.
Lansing, that's the way Lansing went about it. They decided, as a city, they decided that the service line is part of the municipal water supply, the system. Part
How
of the
could
system,
it not be?
right? But as of this point, under Chicago ordinances, under the plumbing code, that part from the shut-off box in front of your home to where it comes into your home is your property. It's
Yeah,
private
yeah,
property.
yeah.
And so that's one of the ways that the city's been able to deflect any kind of accountability for this up till now.
Commonwealth Edison has a service drop that comes onto every house, and it goes down into the meter, and everything on the other side of the meter belongs to Commonwealth Edison. If there's a problem, if a storm knocks that power line down, it's ComEd that comes out and fixes it. Because ComEd and all the other utilities, the understanding is with telephone, internet, whatever it is, gas, the understanding is that they are responsible for everything up to the, let's call it the terminal point where your house joins into it. I guess they're saying that the shut-off box out in front is that terminal point.
They are.
But it's kind of unfair because it's buried underground. And
Well, and it sets up a situation once again that if you're buying a home that was built before 1986,
Yeah.
there's nothing in the requirements in the buyer-seller agreements or the home inspection that involves the lead service line. That
Yeah.
just doesn't exist.
Yeah, yeah.
And so essentially you're buying a home where the city of Chicago, by law, required the use of lead to convey water to that home until 1986. Now it's saying that pipe is your property, but you might not even know that part of the home is your property.
Yeah.
It's mostly underground.
Yeah.
It's not something you're necessarily aware of. So it's a classic catch-22
Yeah, yeah.
that you're supposed to fix a problem you don't even know exists.
Well, I know this is unrelated, but it's fresh in my mind that someone I know on our block sold her house or attempted to sell her house, and then when the inspection came that she paid for, they discovered that there was, I forget what the name of that stuff was, but it was this insulation that was used in the 30s.
Vermiculite. Yeah,
vermiculite.
Yeah.
Which of
A lot
course,
of asbestos
right,
in it, right.
has some trace asbestos in it.
And it's dangerous.
And
actually, yeah.
you know, our entire attic was filled with this stuff. So what do? The prospective buyers are saying, forget it, I'm not buying this house. It's got asbestos in it. And
Well, usually what happens in those cases, I've bought and sold a few homes in my day, and you reach a deal where the seller knocks off
Right.
however many thousands
Yeah.
of dollars that you negotiate for that.
Yeah.
I could see that potentially happening if there's a lead service line in a home and you're buying that home. Hey, you're gonna knock 10 grand
Yeah,
off
yeah,
or whatever like
yeah.
that.
This is, as I said, this is unrelated, but it just struck a nerve
yeah.
with me because the way this one was resolved was that she agreed to have it remediated and then sold the house. But I'm thinking, why would you remediate this stuff? I mean, because the act of
left in
taking
place,
it out is
exactly.
worse.
That is
the
an
best
issue.
thing to do with it is encapsulate it, right?
If it's left with the insulation issue, you're right.
Yeah.
If it's left alone,
Right.
it's
That's
not
not the
going to be a
same as
problem.
the
If it's
lead
not
pipe.
respirable, right?
Right, that's
But if
right.
let's say if you are going to put a ceiling fan in, for example, you might be disrupting
Yeah,
that
and blowing it all over your baby's crib or whatever.
But here, That's not an issue with these lead service lines.
No, it's not.
Every time you turn on the faucet, you're
Right.
potentially getting
That's
a
right.
slug of lead.
Right. Well, okay, so
Really upbeat, isn't it?
it is, and you know you have to say that this is a major issue for municipalities, but it does seem like other municipalities have dealt with it in more adult ways than ours has.
And if they aren't, they're at least trying to.
Right.
I would put it that way.
Yeah.
You've got Galesburg, Illinois. It's a much smaller community than Chicago. It's got a big lead service line problem. And they've actually, it's so bad in a certain part of their community that they've actually violated the federal standard that almost nobody violates.
Yeah.
And so there's a concerted effort in Galesburg to get those lead service lines out. I think they have something like 16,000. We might have in Chicago something on the order of 385,000.
Oh, I'm sure it must
So
be at
it
least
seems
that many, yeah.
staggering, but once again, we had these water mains, some of which even were wood when they first started digging them
Right,
out.
right.
That's how old they were.
Yeah.
We can figure out a way to replace those. I can't help but think that we can figure out a way to deal with these lead service lines as well.
It's just a lot more hassle because you have to deal with all these individual people and schedules and all that. But it's hard. It's definitely hard. So can we just change subject real briefly?
Sure,
You
okay.
wrote recently about the U.S. Steel plant in Portage, Indiana.
Oh, right,
And how
okay, sure, yeah.
chromium and hexavalent chromium is being dumped into our precious lake. So talking about that, there's another thing that the water department has to filter out of the water is chromium because there's some steel plant is throwing it in there. What's the backstory on that?
First of all, there are a number of facilities, especially on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, that legally are allowed to dump a set amount of hexavalent chromium into Lake Michigan every year. So that's happening, and it's showing up in our water supply at levels that are higher than what the state of California said as a health goal, but considerably lower than the regulatory limit that California later set. There is no,
And I'm sure
and this isn't drinking water.
I'm sure that our new EPA says there's no problem.
Well,
at
that's
all.
yeah. Well, so
The
that
revised
so
EPA.
well, but under the Obama administration, the EPA was working on this, but they never got around to it, and they've been sued. The EPA has been sued. It was under the Obama administration to start doing something about this because the science says that hexavalent chromium, and this is a form of a particularly toxic form of chromium that a lot of people might remember from the movie Erin Brockovich, which was Julia Roberts won an Oscar for it and whatnot. A true story about a woman who took on a big gas utility in Southern California, and it became a real problem because what science has shown is that hexavalent chromium can cause stomach cancer. So the research is out there showing this is a risk. But we've had trouble as a country coming to grips with it. And to make matters worse, there are certain limits in permits for how much an individual factory can release into the water. And hexavalent chromium is so toxic that the U.S. Steel plant in Portage is only allowed to dump 0.51 pounds of chrome 6 hexavalent chromium into the water every day.
Half a pound, basically.
Half a pound, roughly. So in
I wonder how they got to the point that they got 0.51.
Right, good question.
We want to dump more than half a pound.
But in April of last year, there was a spill at that facility where at least 396 pounds of hexavalent chromium went into the water. And later there was a report that the company sent to the Indiana Regulatory Department, could have been as high as almost 1,000 pounds. So it exposed what has been a chronic malfunctions at this particular steel plant. They use hexavalent chromium to chrome steel that's forged at the Gary Works down the river closer to Chicago. And so there's been repeated problems at this particular facility. Law students from the University of Chicago at the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic working with surfers from a group called Surf Rider that surf Lake Michigan. There's some of the best waves on the Great Lakes are there in the southern basin of Lake Michigan, sued the federal government to get something done. And what's happened is there's been a legal settlement between U.S. Steel and the federal government that both sides claim will resolve these issues.
We should say the city of Chicago joined in on that, right?
Well, they attempted to. They filed their own lawsuit. They attempted to be involved in the negotiations on a settlement. They were rejected by the Trump administration from being involved. Oh. And now the city has said, we are intervening with the federal court because we don't feel the punishment is harsh enough to prevent U.S. Steel from continuing to do this. And I will say the history of that company in Northwest Indiana, in the southern part of Lake Michigan, is long and troubled. Yeah. And the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972. They didn't start getting control of emissions from U.S. Steel until 1978. That's how hard that company fought the EPA in trying to clean up the pollutants that they were dumping into our lake. And so, people take that very seriously. Yeah. And the city did find there was a plume of hexavalent chromium they found drifting toward a water intake at 68th Street. Now, it wasn't, super alarming by the time that water was treated. But it does show, and I think this episode shows, that there are these ongoing threats, industrial threats to our drinking water supply, that if left unchecked by either the state of Indiana or the EPA, the city of Chicago has and will get involved in that, and certain individuals like the Surf Rider Foundation, the surfers involved in that case, and the folks at U of C, they're going to step through using authority that's granted to citizens under the Clean Water Act, that if the government isn't doing its job, you can sue to make the government do its job and make companies clean up their act.
Yeah. Well, you know what? The next time you're on, I want to talk about microfibers and microplastics.
Oh, that's another one.
Because we just saw a story, BBC just did a story yesterday or the day before about microplastics in the Arctic. That
they're in Lake Michigan, too.
Well, I know you've written about that.
Yes.
But I mean, it's just really interesting to see that they're finding them when they do core samples of the ice, of recent ice, that it's been there for a long time.
Since we had plastic.
Since we've had plastic, yeah. Plastics, my friend. All right, well, I just always enjoy sitting here talking to you. I could do hours and hours on this, but it's such an interesting topic, and it's something that we all need to care about. And,
it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom.
No, it doesn't.
My point is that, look, we have more information now. We can, and we've, at the Tribune, we've provided that to people in Chicago.
And
so we can get the conversation going again on this.
I think that's absolutely right.
And look, I mean, people are concerned about this issue. We saw this in the number of test kits that have been requested in the last 2 years alone. I'm sure there are going to be more. We're going to find out even more about this issue.
You should do this.
And,
do it.
And so as a result, that puts more pressure on elected officials to do something about it. And that's essentially one of the roles that we see at the Tribune, our newsroom. That's what we're here for.
Well, this gives me the opportunity to ring my favorite bell, which is to say that in these times that we're living in now, more than ever, we need regulatory agencies that work. And right now that's being threatened. But even more than that, we need newsrooms that work. And I'm so glad that we still have a couple of really good, thriving newsrooms in Chicago. A couple of TV, radio, some printed press. It's so critical that we support them. And that is really what it comes down to. I'm sure you don't want to comment on it, but I feel very good about the fact that you guys had such a strong union vote. I think that was a good thing.
I'm on the organizing committee, so I will say, we are standing up for what we believe in, and we believe in serving the community and speaking truth to power and exploring our community, our very diverse community.
Right.
And we want to make sure that the current owners and the future owners of the Chicago Tribune invest in quality journalism, and so we can continue doing our jobs.
If you just look over the last couple of years of things just the Tribune alone has done, from the the assessor's office all the way down to the things that you're doing, and it's just so vital, because we wouldn't know about any of this stuff if there weren't people who are employed as journalists whose job is to go out there and look for stuff. It doesn't come out, it doesn't just reveal itself.
That's a real privilege for me personally, and I think I speak for everyone in the newsroom, that we really value our mission, and we're committed to it, and we're looking for more support, not just from our subscribers, but also from our employer.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's why we called this show Chicago Newsroom, because we really love newsrooms, and we think newsrooms are one of the most vital places in a democracy. So thanks to Michael Hawthorne. Appreciate you coming here. Hope we'll see you again soon, real soon.
Thanks to have me.
I'm Ken Davis saying thank you very much for watching, and we'll be back again next week with yet another program, and I hope you'll be here for that. We're going to talk about bicycling, the world of bicycling, dockless bikes. We'll talk about that next week with John Greenfield, so we're looking forward to that. Come on back. And again, remember, you can see all of our shows and all of our backlog of interesting discussions by going to this address right here. See you next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.